Madam Clerk, I believe it is now 6 o'clock. Okay. It's now 6 o'clock, and I'll call the ARPA workshop to order. Welcome this evening, everyone. We will begin our night with a presentation from Eric Miller, who's our Finance and Administrative Director. So, Eric.
Thank you, Madam President, and good evening, City Council. So tonight, we are going to talk a little bit about the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. And what we're going to start off with tonight is just a slide and a few different slides throughout the presentation, just to kind of show where we are with ARPA and what other kind of funding sources we have as a city. And this first one just illustrates all of the different types of federal or state funding that the city receives to accomplish many different goals. And so you can see that we do have CDBG funding that we get on an annual basis. During COVID, there was 3 additional allocations that the city received, and that's what CV1, CV2, and CV3 represent. We also receive an annual allocation from HOME, that's our home funds. We also had $2.4 million from the ARPA Act that was allocated to the consortium, which is made up of not just the city of Beloit, but also the city of Janesville and the surrounding areas. So that allocation does not just go to the city of Beloit. We don't have our exact share on that particular piece yet, but we'll get some relative piece of the pie of that. The ARPA funds that we're here to talk about tonight, which is made up of 2 separate funding sources, one of transit of about $624,000 and the other one of $15.2 million, which is the general government allocation that we received. We also have some TIF housing funds that have become available starting in 2022 and will receive more next year in 2023 for a total of about $12.5 million. By state statute, 75% of that money has to be used for affordable housing. 25% has to be used to improve housing stock. It does not have to be only in the TIF districts that they came from. It can be used throughout the whole entire city. So those are some of the major buckets that we have of different funding sources that the city has at its disposal to use. So the reason that we're here tonight, though, is the main focus is the ARPA funding. And again, that's made up of transit and then the general government. We're going to focus more on the general government side because transit has to be used for the transit utility, not for the general government services. And so if we kind of look at the timeline of ARPA and when it came about and what it all meant, on March 11th, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act into law. And that established the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. And so the intended purpose of that was to support state, local governments to help build back up after the coronavirus pandemic. So that's what the whole intent of ARPA was. And it hit things outside or in excess of what the CARES Act did. The CARES Act hit some very specific things. ARPA is a little bit more broad. So the allocations that the city of Beloit received, which is $15.2 million, was generated based on the CDBG funding allocation. So the city of Beloit is an entitlement community. Therefore, they use basically the same funding calculation that we do for CDBG, and therefore that's how the money was distributed throughout the state, and we are an entitlement community. So we were a direct recipient of money from the state or from the federal government, from the U.S. Treasury, versus going through the state of Wisconsin to get our allocations. We received those 2 allocations in 2 equal installments. The first one of $7.6 million in July of 2021. We're going to get the second installment in July of 2022, equal installments. So the final guidance on the ARPA was just released in January of this year. So it took a while to work under what they called the interim final rule. And what that really was a way to get some guidance out to locals and state municipalities so that you could kind of take a look and see what things might be eligible under the ARPA Act. And so through a lot of public input that the U.S. government received, they finally put all the Q&As together, all the different suggestions and so forth, and came up with the final guidance. That guidance came out in January. It became effective on April 1 of 2022. So we're only in June of 2022, so we're still kind of right in that wheelhouse of starting to kind of look at this and getting some projects out there. So the funds must be obligated or under contract by the end of 2024. So we still have 2.5 years to get it obligated, and then you still have an additional 2 years to actually spend the money. So be under contract, get the work done, you can then still spend the money outside or after that December 31st, 2024 date. So those are kind of the main dates that we're working under today. And by the time that rolls around, it's quite possible that there could be potential extensions if needed and so forth. Generally that happens. I haven't seen anything on that yet. So we're working under these timelines. So the main 4 eligibility criteria that ARPA introduced was the first being to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and what its negative impacts were on the economy. The second one was premium pay to essential workers during the public health emergency. The third one is a big one in the fact that many places shut down, so there was a lot of revenue loss when it came to the pandemic. A lot of people didn't have additional expenses, but it was hurt more on the revenue side than it was on the expense side. Generally speaking, that's not true for all the case, but it was very apparent for us at the city. And then the fourth main category is necessary investments to water, sewer, stormwater, and in broadband infrastructure. Stormwater was one that we talked about. That interim rule to the final rule really defined, the interim rule did not define stormwater as a project that would be eligible under the initial ARPA interim final rule. So throughout discussions, stormwater was then added into the final rule. So that's just an example of what happened between March 11th and January 1 when they published that final rule. So City Council approved our 2022 CIP and operating budget in November of 21, and that budget included 4 projects that included some funding sources from the original ARPA. That interim final rule, these were what we were working under at the time, and they qualified by falling into one of those 4 kind of general areas that we just spoke about. The first one being Elm Street, Oak Street, Roosevelt Street design. That fell under the infrastructure piece of the eligibility criteria. The PD tactical operation equipment for $56,000 and City Hall air handling system for $250,000 fell under the response to the negative impact of COVID eligibility criteria. And then the third or fourth project here, the ambulance replacement of $222,000, really qualified under 2 separate categories. One would have been revenue reduction, and the other one would have been a COVID response. Obviously, the ambulance was an integral part of helping out with the pandemic, and so that is a clear eligible expense under ARPA. So some of the key decision-making criteria or principles that we looked at, we wanted to make sure that we knew that these were one-time sources of funds. This is not a long-term sustainable funding source where we could fund continued operational type things. So we wanted to make sure that the things that we were looking at were really one-time uses, similar to what we might look at when we're looking at our fund balance policies and how we might apply fund balance to a particular budget. item. We wanted to make sure that these things that we bring forward are really one-time uses, but also sustainable uses. So that we want to tie those into our strategic plan and have that three-pillared framework of economic, environmental, and social sustainability. And if we can reach those criterias within the projects that we end up using the money on, then it's, hitting more than one, kind of killing two birds with one stone. We also want to look at the long-term impacts. We want these projects to have a lasting impact, not something that will be very quick. We want that to have an impact on the community. And which is the reason why we wanted to take that deliberate approach. We didn't just jump right in, have 15 million, allocate it right away. We wanted to kind of take a step back, let the dust settle, get that final rule in place so that we knew exactly what those criteria were, and then we could take that deliberate approach to bring forth ideas that will accomplish all those other items that we're talking about in this list. We also want to take how can we leverage these uses or these funding sources with other available funding sources that we have? Looking at our existing long-range capital improvement plan and seeing how some of these items that we have in here might also connect with maybe something that we already have a project for, and you can leverage that money and make it, kind of expand it and get more bang for your buck. Also, we had to know that by deferring maintenance on some items, that's just going to create higher costs in the future by deferring those maintenance costs. So that was just another criteria that we looked at. And then also park and recs, equipment, parks, shelters, things like that were heavily used during the pandemic because of their outdoor nature being outside. And so we wanted to take a look and see what we had in our plans for future park and rec things that we could look at and see how we might be able to, use some of this money for those items. So some of the criteria then when we looked at the infrastructure projects, we wanted to take a look at what criteria or what did we need to evaluate on each of those projects to help us make a better decision. And so this isn't all of them, but some of them. So lead water service replacement, that's very important. So we can kind of look and see, where do we need lead service lines replaced in the city? It's also required to be replaced by the US EPA. So we kind of looked at those regulatory type things that we knew that at some point we're going to have to do anyway. So how can we leverage these dollars for a project that we know ultimately needs to be done? We also looked at census tracts that were hit hardest by the pandemic. Sub-6 water main replacement, again, another regulatory mandatory thing that needs to be done that's mandated by the state. We looked at water break history, fire flow capacity, regulatory compliance. We also then know that when you replace infrastructure, you also have to repair or replace the roadway in which it lies under. And so we kind of looked at roadway conditions and then, try to parlay that into a street resurfacing or street replacement. Impact on future development and housing. And then, of course, I mentioned the sustainability efforts earlier in regards to some of the other criteria. So those are some of the things that we looked at when looking at projects that we had coming down the pike. So I know this is very tiny and small, and it's just a portion of the list, but it's not designed to show you what the projects are per se, but it's really designed to show you the matrix that we plugged all of those criteria into by project, by criteria, with different scoring methods or models that place numbers in those columns. And so the idea would be try to find that project that hits multiple categories in your criteria. And then you sort those by the most need to the least need and see where those kind of fall out. So This is just a design or a tool that we used to help determine what some of those higher priority projects might look like. And again, we have limited dollars, $15.2 million. Sounds like a lot of money, but in reality, it's not that much when you look at the total need of the city. So we have, in one of these criteria, just for instance, the fire flow increases in system reliability were actually pulled from a comprehensive study that we did in 2017. So it wasn't just us going around guessing at these things. We actually had some studies that were done in the past that we were using as some of our basis. So this is going to be the first of a series of maps just to illustrate where you can then see where some of the needed items are that we just talked about. And so this particular map illustrates two of the criteria overlapping, one of them being the sub 6-inch water mains and the other one being roadway condition. So the red lines on the map indicate a score of 1 to 3, and 1 being the worst graded road. So 10 being the best graded road. So you can see that those are roads that need repair anyway, but also have 6-inch water main or sub 6-inch water main underneath that road. So those would be projects that we might want to look at to do first, because we know ultimately they need to be done anyway. And so I don't want to dig up a road that might have a score of 10, meaning it's a brand new road, and then have to turn around and do that again. So this is just one of the maps that we looked at to try to place those different criteria to get a more visual feel of where those particular projects might be located. And just as a note, if we took all of the 6-inch sub 6-inch water main in the city and replaced that, that would be roughly about $3 million. That does not include any of the road work that would take to repair. That's just to replace the sub 6-inch. So you could imagine then replacement of the pavement on top of it is just going to increase the costs. Also, DNR has commented on our last 2 utility audits that we do need to get the sub 6 inches replaced. So again, we look at regulatory compliance, how we might be able to do some of those things. You also look at sub 6-inch water mains. That's harder or less flow in terms of firefighting efforts. So trying to get those mains up to 6 or higher would increase fire flows. So there's a safety element included in all that as well. And now the clicker's not going to work. Let's see. There we go. So this map is just it's a zoomed out map intending just to show where the active lead service lines are in the city. So the red, and that's why it was easier to see when we zoomed out, because it just concentrated everything together to make it more visual appealing. But this shows where the lead service lines are located in the city. And so if you were to replace every lead service line in the city, it would cost roughly about $15 million just to replace the lines. That does not include any of the pavement restoration. If we did that, it would be at least another 10 to 15 million on top of that to do the pavement restoration as well. So it kind of gives you an idea of what the cost is to do these types of projects. And so when you look at that 15.2 million, you really realize that we need significantly more to be able to do everything that needs to be done.
Eric, do you mind if I jump in real quick on the lead-based lines?
Yep.
So I'm going to channel my inner Bill Frisbee this evening, who had a conflict and was unable to be here tonight. We do have our city engineer, Scott Prindeville, in the audience. I wanted to reiterate for the public that while we have a lot of lead-based lines in the city, again, due to the chemistry of our water, we continue to test pardon the pun, completely unintended. When we do our water testing and we're looking at where our lead-based lines are, and we do interior home testing on an annual basis, we are not finding lead levels in our water. However, there is still a regulatory requirement that we replace these lines, and our residents won't be able to take advantage of the grant program that the council approved in order to replace their private lines until we replace our lines. And so I just wanted to clarify that there's not an immediate health risk, but there certainly is a need to replace these lines over time. Thank you.
Yep, and Bill did mention to me that same point, wanted to make sure that that point got made when I was presenting this particular slide, and that there is currently not a timeline at this point to replace those because we have not exceeded the levels, the testing levels that City Manager Luther was just speaking of. So that we aren't under any particular timeline from the state to do that because the water is still very good here. And so we have just under 3,000 city side lead lines that need to be replaced. And so we talk about that leveraging of funds again that we were mentioning earlier. This is a way to leverage those. So if they get replaced on the city side, it opens up the ability for the residents to apply for the grant funding that we received from the state earlier this year to accomplish this private side. So this map shows the qualified census tracts in the city of Beloit. So some of these tracts, these are federal census tracts. So you would see that some of these census tracts actually fall outside of the city of Beloit. Just know that any project that we would do that falls within these tracts would of course be within the city of Beloit, not outside of the city limits. But the census tracts themselves do tend to overlap municipal boundaries or jurisdictions. So the reason I'm showing you these is because qualified census tracts are directly, essentially eligible expenditures in those qualified census tracts for ARPA funding. And so I wanted to illustrate to you all where our qualified census tracts are located. And a lot of that has to do with our parks projects. So this is where we would be trying to look at where these are located, what parks would be located in these particular qualified census tracts, and then see what projects we might have in our future CIPs that could then qualify for expenditure here. And so all of this is leading to the final staff recommendation based on all of the needs that we have in the city, based on the costs of all of the infrastructure that we have, as we illustrated throughout the presentation, to try and allocate $10 million towards infrastructure. A couple months back, we passed the resolution that we've essentially already allocated $2 million toward the homelessness project. We are asking for another $2 million of park improvement projects, which would encompass any park and rec type programs. $645,000 in cybersecurity, which could include fiber optics or additional upgrades to the city infrastructure, city networks infrastructure. And then the 2022 CIP projects that I went over earlier on in the presentation have already been approved. So in essence, it's already been allocated of $555,000. So in all, that would equal the 15.2 million that we were allocated. And that concludes the PowerPoint portion of my presentation, and of course I would welcome any feedback or comments or questions. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Eric, for that wonderful presentation, and I'm sure counselors have comments and questions, and that's fine, but I think it's really important tonight. You gave such a great presentation, but it's critical that we have input from our residents and our public that are here tonight. So in respect to them, I would like it if anyone is wishing to speak tonight, that you come forward, give your name and address. If you have any input or questions at this time, they are certainly welcome. And staff is here to try to answer those questions. If they can't, they will follow up with you. So please feel free to come forward and just state your name and address for the record.
How everybody doing tonight? Great job, Eric. Jawan Winfield, 1806 Park Avenue, Beloit, Wisconsin. I just I wanted to know was with the park, what ideas do the city council have about the park, as in with the funds that's coming from the ARP?
So, Juwan, is your question, is that one of the things that you would like for us to look at? Do you feel that's a need in this community? So we could just speak to that.
Thank you. Well, it's just so much that we can do with the parks that we have. I think, and I'm just speaking from softball. Right now, we have one of the biggest citywide leagues in here in Beloit. They play at Telfer right now, I believe, and it's age groups from, I want to say 7 to 12, and then we don't really have anything right now for the middle school for softball or baseball. Everything has to go through the Y. But if the great city council would come together, maybe with some community members, the new AD at the high school, and have that conversation on what we can do to build up some parks, maybe turn one into a home field for our girls softball team, and maybe for our boys softball team. I think it'd be really good for us just to try to embrace that going forward. Since I'm a school board member now, it's really nice just to have eyes on a lot of different things, and I think that's one thing that the school board and the city council can work together on, is to get an idea of what we can really give this to children going forward.
Thank you very much
No
for
problem.
that input.
You guys have a great night.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak, please come forward at this time.
Good evening, members of the council. My name is Jim Reesberg. I live at 2795 Fuller Drive. This is my first time speaking before the council as a private citizen. Spent too much time here over a 29-year career, but I move on. I went to Public Works in the spring when they were going to do the restriping of Cranston Road for the public hearings out at the Public Works facility. Had a discussion with the Public Works director and asked her or her staff to come and look at Fuller Drive between Cranston Road and Freeman Parkway. I moved to Fuller Drive about 12 years ago. I believe that Fuller Drive was probably put in excess originally behind Walmart and behind Menards. I would imagine a little over 20 years ago. To my knowledge, that stretch of street has never been resurfaced in that time frame. I do have pictures that I can share with you at another time, but last night my wife and I walked that section from Cranston Road to about 3/4 the way to Freeman Parkway, and I counted 232 patches on that street. There is no curb and gutter. There is no storm sewer except for right at Cranston and Fuller, and then a section that's about, I would say, 50 yards before you get to Freeman Parkway, where there's curb and gutter and there is storm sewer. Every winter, our street becomes more and more full of potholes, and along each side of that, because of the plow hitting it, is the asphalt is crumbling and has gone away. After I met with the Public Works Director in the early spring, they did come out and do some additional gravel on the side of the roadway, but that's gone now because of the heavy traffic with the construction of the Spine Center, which is now just north of my house, and with the development more in Deerfield and in The second section of the Oaks is a lot of heavy equipment. Traffic comes down Fuller. I don't believe they're supposed to, but it is a shortcut from using Milwaukee Road. And all the stop and go lights and stuff and the redirecting of traffic, that has just about increased our traffic at least 5 to 10-fold daily. And with that increased heavy traffic, we also have a lot of car traffic, and along with the road stuff, our neighborhood has become a community trash and garbage deposit. And just to give you some of the things that my wife and I have called Public Works on or have personally taken care of things, is we pick up fast food and trash every day. Garbage bag deposits, deposits of tires, deposits of furniture, including couches, mattresses, and big screen TVs. None of this big screen TV did not work, I can tell you that. Deposits of bags of used diapers, deposits of hundreds of aluminum cans just about every other day, deposits of lumber that are thrown on the side of the road. And I think we don't have the storm sewer in front of where we live. It's just a culvert system. So we have storm sewer on the north toward Freeman Parkway, and there's a little storm sewer to our south where Fuller Drive connects to Cranston Road. I don't understand that. So I'd invite any of you to come out to my home, and I'll take you on a tour if you'd like to go, to see the deterioration of that. The east side of that street is owned by Walmart and by Menards. So they have, and when I've talked to members at Public Works, they said, well, that's their property. They're supposed to clean it up, but nobody does. And my wife walks every day and has to take 2 trash bags with her just to pick up trash along Fuller Drive. And it's become really an eyesore. So with your wisdom and with your authority, it certainly would be nice if you came and looked at it, or at least did something with the roadway, amount of these funds that can be used for improving roadway. And I don't know why the storm sewer was never put in that stretch. And this goes back probably to the late 80s, early 90s, when the developers were grumpy old men. For those that were around here that might, Julie, that might remember grumpy old men in that development. But I don't understand why part of the street has curb and gutter, the rest does not. And because of all the stuff that's happened with the development, which is great development, don't get me wrong. Development's good for a city. Along the Milwaukee Road corridor we are now the shortcut when people come off of the interstate and understand that Fuller Drive is there. They come behind Menards and Walmart and come down Fuller Drive, and it's taken a beating. So I just request that you take that into consideration. It's my pleasure to be with you tonight. It's really nice to see all of you, and thank you very much for your consideration. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Reesberg. A staff will follow up with you. Anyone else wishing to speak, please come forward. State your name and address for the record, please.
Steve Holland, 1617 Emerson Street. Just a quick question. Will this be on the city website to view? It would help, especially with the maps and the small print.
Yes, and it's a question that's been coming to, I've been seeing it on Facebook, and yes, it will be rebroadcast.
Thank you.
And if you have any further questions, Eric Miller will be the person that you contact, and any of the counselors will have the information, or you can certainly go on the city's website. Yes. Anyone else wishing to speak, please come forward.
Good evening, Council. Thank you for the opportunity to address you. John Fleiter, Family Services, 416 College Street. And I must say that seeing Jim Reesberg up here was sort of a traumatic flashback for me. 20-some years ago, he was on our board of directors. And one of the first comments he said in a meeting was, let's give the new guy enough rope to hang himself. And I have not forgotten that. So I just wanted to give you a brief update on our housing project, which also could be considered, I think, if not more appropriately, as an effort to address the intergenerational transmission of poverty. I think many of you are aware that we did not have the opportunity to purchase the Royce School. That was an interesting surprise and reminded us that we're newbies in this kind of property acquisition process. The good news is that we have two locations that, frankly, in hindsight, I think will be better for us, and we're actively negotiating on both of them. So we're hoping to have a very quick answer as to where you guys going to try to situate this. And we've been working with Joe Stottleman from Angus Young and have really valued his expertise and perspective on this. I also want you to know that one of the questions that keeps coming up, rightfully so, regarding our project is, okay, after you build this thing, how are you going to keep it going? And that's really a two-part question. How do you pay the staff? And the second part of that is how you pay the utilities operational costs. The good news is that we've secured a grant for $340,000 that can be used for this project. The bad news is that it may not continue out as many years as what we need. There's some question as to when the sunset will be on that. So we're still looking and working on the issues of how we will cover the occupancy costs, the operations on that. And it's difficult to raise money for a project that doesn't exist yet, but we have some funders and we're working with them with a letter of interest in terms of the project. And I think that that will give us some confidence that we're not in the wilderness on this. So I thank you very much for your interest in this project. I'm glad to see that there's continued interest and support for increasing not only available housing, but I'm adamant in terms of my perspective that this is one of the best approaches to addressing poverty among children. And I think with the early learning information that's out there, as well as the impact of early childhood experiences, this is a unique opportunity to really create a positive impact. And I think it's going to have an impact on not only on these kids, but their peers in the school system onward in life. So thank you very much for your time. And see, I can be brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I believe, just speaking of what Mr. Fleiter, I'm sorry, Brittany, I was just going to say, speaking of what Mr. Fleiter just spoke about, I remember earlier, Eric also mentioned in his report that we also committed up to $2 million, I believe. Is that correct, Eric? To go toward transitional housing? Okay, I just wanted to make note of that, didn't we? He said we did, right?
Well, we did,
Okay.
but it changed. It said to at least
Okay,
2 million.
to at least 2 million, but I just wanted to make sure we had that on the record. Okay, all right, thank you very much, Mr. Fleiter. Go ahead.
Good evening, Council. My name is Brittany Keys. I live at 1611 East Ridge Road. And when it comes to ARPA, I believe you all appreciate that I have quite a few things that I could say and talk about. Thank you for the presentation, Eric, and I also want to thank the gentleman whose wife picks up garbage alongside the road, too. We're out, my daughter and I are out there with her. And so when it comes to ARPA funding, one of the first things I want to bring up is when we look at ARPA eligibility and then looking at the Fed's final ruling, one of the things on this handout that just strikes me is that that one of the big things that we're eligible to spend ARPA funding on would be more medical expenses, behavioral health, and preventing and responding to violence. I just want to highlight that those are eligible ARPA spending type of investments for our community. Other eligible uses could be for aid regarding employment, job training, food, rent, mortgages, utility, affordable housing development, childcare, early education, addressing learning loss, and many other uses, trying to help the communities most impacted by the COVID crisis. And just highlighting back in November, which was Youth Homelessness Awareness Month, that's when I started speaking out when I was sitting beside many of you on the importance and the urgency of moving forward with some of this ARPA discussion and the ARPA dollars. Other communities such as La Crosse and other, I believe maybe Eau Claire, issued funding for emergency housing to help with those experiencing housing crisis in the winter. Months passed, we didn't have a discussion after the initial September presentation, and it seemed that every week I was giving an update on the number of youth that were identified as homeless with the district. And so when I just see the ARPA eligibility here, I really want to highlight that the human element of where these funds can go to cannot be ignored. I really would like council to consider the human aspect and where our community has been hurt. So the city of Madison has allocated about 1/3 of their funds towards housing, emergency housing, mental health, and addressing violence. So we're not Madison, but we have needs in this community, looking at all of those things: decreasing violence, mental health, housing, and affordable housing. And speaking to what the district numbers are, like this is still it's still a crisis, and the housing crunch continues. Availability is a big issue. Yes, we did move forward with allocating up to $2 million to homelessness, but really that's not enough. When you look at the percentages of how much funds we got to the need in our community. I also want to highlight that Janesville, which is almost twice our size, got about $2 million less than we did. It has to be because our need is greater. What we bring in from state and federal funding is higher. We were identified as a community that had higher needs, so we need to put it in to invest. It's an investment into those that need it most. So I implore you to consider, where it might not be as clear here on this presentation, more the human aspect, and I'm happy to send the final ruling of the Treasury and kind of highlight those areas on what can be eligible. And please support the transitional living project directly. This is a way to be meaningful with kind of stopping the cycle of poverty and trauma and helping decrease violence and just improving quality of life here in Beloit. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you very much, Ms. Keys. And we're certainly passionate about that, and that's why we're having this tonight, to hear the needs that the people have. We want you to continue and let us know what those are for you, because we certainly will consider those as we move forward in this process.
Good evening, City Council. I'm Teresa Henderson, 1223 Prairie Avenue in the beautiful city of Beloit. I want to thank the City Council for the beautiful presentation. It did answer a lot of my questions, but I really want to thank my fellow resident, because I was going to say pretty much the same thing she was saying, because I researched this, and we have to make sure we stay focused on the human element of Beloit. And there's a lot of homelessness in Beloit. I mean, if you go over to the bridge over there by Cubs, there's a lot of people living underneath their bridge. And that's really a sad commentary for this beautiful city we call Beloit. And if we can prevent the homelessness, if we can invest more money to prevent homelessness, then, and more education, more programs that we can have to help our people. And this comes from COVID as well, because a lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people suffered during the pandemic because of lack of food. I know there was a lot of programs that was out there. Yes, some people took advantage of those programs, but the majority of the people needed those programs. And they're still suffering to this day for the pandemic. So I think the human element needs to take place. I understand, I think that's awesome that we have the streets and how we're gonna dig up the streets and we're gonna do the pipelines, because those are needed. But our people need a place to sleep. They need a place to sleep. And we have the libraries and all these other places and churches opening up their doors so people can come in and get air conditioning, and they can get heat, and they can get food from like Emmanuel and places like that. But we need to feed our people. We need to make sure that they have places to lay their heads. So when you do that to a family, to a child, then they go into the school system, then we have another issue. Then we have to go talk to the school board like this. So I would thank this young lady and her daughter. She right here. I thank you, and I thank the City Council for listening to us tonight.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else wishing to speak please come forward at this time?
Good evening to all of you. I didn't come well prepared.
Can you state your name and
everybody else.
address
Oh,
for the
I'm so
record?
sorry. I was going to get to that.
Oh,
I didn't come prepared like everyone else. My name is Angel Richardson. I live at 2165 Riverside Drive. And I'm going to keep the emotions back because homeless kids, I have dealt with it all year. Parents living in their cars with 3- and 4-year-olds. Parents moving out of the state because the landlord went $300 and $400 up on their rent. It's not right. $1,100 they pay already, and then when they go up like that, where are the jobs? There's no jobs for the parents, basically. I just want to say, we really need to take this seriously. Our kids, our 3- and 4-year-old kids should not be sleeping in cars. Landlords should not be going up on their rent just to get over to make $1. It's sad. And most of these homes are dumps that they want $1,300, $1,400 for. It is not right. Thank you for listening.
thank you very much. Would anyone else wishing to speak please come forward at this time? And if you could state your name and address for the record, please.
Good evening. My name is Eunice Glass, and I was here before. I live at 2035 Mountain Avenue, Beloit, Wisconsin. I was here before, and it's about the kids. Some of this money needs to go to the Beloit School District that is in debt. They have like a $10 million deficit. So the kids that are homeless and have been out of school almost 2 years, they need all the help they can get. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else wishing to speak please come forward at this time? I'll just do one last call. Anyone wishing to speak in favor, please come forward at this time. Thank you all for your input tonight. It was very much appreciated, and we haven't stopped listening, so this is just the start. What I'll do is I'll go around and take comments or questions from counselors. We could start with Counselor Day and then go around, if that would be helpful, and then I'll just give the closing comments, if that's okay with everyone. Okay. Counselor Day.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have any questions about what was presented. Eric did a fine job of explaining, where we're at and what the staff recommendations are, and it was great that everybody came out and gave us their comments. I guess the question is, as time goes on and we do the planning, with the council members here, there's a lot to consider, but it's a pretty big list, so I think we have to be balanced on the decisions that we make. So it's going to take a little bit of effort, but I'm sure we can do it. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Counselor Day. Now, Counselor Terrell.
What I will say is I agree what a lot of people came up here and talked about today. A lot of what I ran on and what I stood for years, even before I got on the council, was a lot of what some of y'all addressed. Homelessness, affordable living in the city of Beloit, and especially the youth, which is another thing that I wanted to kind of make a comment on, because I didn't see recommendations for the youth, and I think that's something we got to also focus on. I have a little bit of ideas of my own, Madam President, if I can express it real quick. I don't know if I had the time, but
May want to be brief tonight.
Just be brief.
The counselors want to.
Right. Well, to be brief, I just know there are some investments that we might need to make in like anything involving the youth. Violence among the youth is going up in the city of Beloit. We're seeing a lot of break-ins, a lot of car thefts, things like that, and it's involving a lot of young people under the age of 18 that's getting involved in these things. Me being a community activist myself and dealing with the youth, I know that a lot of this is causing factors of the uptick in crime in the city of Beloit. So we also have to invest in our youth, and we have to get behind the people who are in the city of Beloit doing things for our youth that might need a little bit more support from the city. And those are the things that I feel like needs to be addressed as well. So I'll just leave it there. I got a whole plan, a whole idea, but I'll just pass it on.
Thank you, Councilor Terrell, and we will certainly work together on that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Councilor Forbeck.
Well, I know that this is going to be one of the most difficult decisions that we make. Heaven knows we wish we could make a huge difference in everybody's life in the city of Beloit. We're just going to have to be as wise as we can be here, and we thank you for talking, everybody. Thank you very much. I do have a question, though, that, Eric, I wonder if you could answer for me. I don't know what a sub-6-inch water main is. Does that just mean a deep water main?
It's the, basically the circumference of the pipe that's in the ground, so instead of
Oh, it's smaller than,
Yeah, it's smaller than 6
okay,
inches.
not talking about where it's
Correct.
at.
Yep.
Okay,
Just the size.
thank you.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. That's all.
Thank you, Vice President Forbeck, because I said Councilor Forbeck, so I'll have to hone in on that. Okay, Councilor Blakely.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for the presentation, Eric, and thank you to all the concerned citizens who came forward tonight. My question is also fundamentally about the sub-6 water mains. Looking at that map with all the red on it, showing the places that need that, how do we prioritize among all of them?
Yeah, so there's two maps. The one that had the zoomed out map that had kind of the red, this one here, this is the lead service line map. If you go back one more in your presentation, you can see where all of the colored lines on the map are sub-6-inch water mains locations. The colored portion of the line indicates the road condition. So it's actually encompassing two separate criteria to look at. And so this is just one of the many criteria that we're looking at to try and prioritize. So the red lines on this particular map might be a higher priority because those are the worst road conditions. And so if we're going to go in and replace a road anyway, we want to see what's underneath that road. And if there's sub-6-inch water mains under there, we're going to take care of two things at one time. And so we want to then try to use the different funding sources that we have at our disposal, whereas the replacement of the sub-6 would be ARPA eligible, whereas just general street resurfacing isn't eligible. And so you want to try and, coordinate these types of projects in your annual CIP process. So just two of the criteria on this map that shows to answer that question.
Yes, that gives me a better understanding. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Councilor Blakely. Next, Councilor Levy.
Thank you also to everyone that came out today to speak up. This is exactly what we need. Eric, I do have a couple of questions. You had said, I believe you said earlier that there were some lines that maybe not need to be replaced right now. Do you know the life span of those that don't need to be replaced right now? That if we see, okay, maybe if we don't replace those lines, we'll have a few extra dollars to put someplace else. Do you have a life expectancy of the lines that?
I don't know if engineering might have something like that in their program. I don't have that off the top of my head, no.
Okay. And then I want to keep in mind that on page 5 or one of the pages where it says staff recommendations.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point that out kind of to the audience that those are just recommendations. We are here tonight to kind of see what the public wants And then when we sit down in a few weeks to develop the budget, that's where we'll take the information, what we're hearing tonight, and see how can we fund it in our budget and with the ARPA dollars. So I put that out there so when people look at it, they don't say, they add it up and it comes to 15.2 and they say, well, they already got the money spent. That's not, I just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Yep, this is a staff recommendation, so that's coming more from my side of the
Saying
fence
if you're
here,
saying
not
if no
council
one
side.
else came forward, at least this is a start of saying, here's exactly what we would do. If nobody was here tonight and we had to spend this money,
Okay.
then here's what we would spend it on. The other piece that I want to make sure we all understand is throughout this process, we often hear people say, well, we need to hire more staff in this department, hire more staff in that department. But I want to caution us with that because since this is one-time funding, when that money runs out, the city would have to pick up the cost of that new employee or employees. And then if we don't have it in our budget, then that person's out of a job. So I'm just throwing things out there so to get people to understand where we are. So I think it's important that we understand that the projects that we hit this with either has to have a long-term effect in the community or something that we can hit within a year, get it fixed, and knowing that we won't get any additional money for that. One of the things that I heard over and over again tonight was like the homelessness, affordable housing, and I always call it, Julie's here and she knows the passion that I've had since I've been on the council. Other councilors that, like Councilor Terrell, everybody here, that's what we talk about. But I want to make sure that if we say right now we have 2 million, staff is recommending 2 million. If we decide to put more into that, I want to make sure that we have a sustainable and realistic plan versus saying we're going to throw 10 million at the homeless. What is the plan to make sure that we're attacking it the way that we need to? Because it's one thing to give it the money, but then it's another thing to put action into place because we can allocate the money, but if we don't have a plan to use this money by 2024 or 2026, we lose it, and there goes that opportunity. So I want to make sure that when we sit down and talk about the budget, if this is something where we see where we want to put money in there, then I guess what I'm going to be looking for somewhere down the road is the plan. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to get it accomplished? Where it's going to benefit the entire community? Because what I want us to understand is this funding that we're getting, it's got to be something that's going to affect and benefit the entire community. So we can't just pick sections that we want to allocate funds to, even with the road repairs. And I'm just using it as an example. I don't want to necessarily say Royce Avenue gets everything and a street on the west side gets nothing. So when we look at that, I want to make sure that we're looking for the entire city because that's what we represent down here and that's what the money is for. So I'm just going to be kind of looking in that direction as well. I guess one of the questions, and I know, thank everybody for allowing me to take a little extra time, but I guess I'd be curious to see some feedback as to the school district's debt. Is there's something that we can do, we cannot do as far as with this funding? How would that look? You don't have to answer tonight, but how would that look? How would that benefit the entire city? And is that something that is allowed? That's something that's not allowed? Just looking at those in particular things that was coming up tonight, and a lot of them was kind of the things that I'm interested in as well. And I would be interested to see when we talk about parks improvements, kind of what are we talking about? If we move with staff recommendation for the 2 million, what are we looking at? Because I'm not saying we don't need it. Trust me, I'm not saying we don't need it. But when I weigh the pros and the cons, and I'm looking at building up the parks and making those beautiful, which is a great thing. But we still have people now that may be living in the parks because they don't have homes to live in. So that's, when I think about all of this, that's kind of what I look at. We could build it up, and then we're going to have people still living on the streets and stuff. That's kind of where my heart goes. We got to get individuals. And granted, there are certain people, whether we believe it or not, that will say, I like where I'm living. I don't want to move. And I think I've talked to Julie enough to know that people will say, nope, I don't want to move. So we need to understand that as well. But I guess to see why we're building up the parks. I don't want to build up the parks for people to sleep in. I'd rather have people in homes or something like that, and then they can enjoy the parks. So I thank the council for allowing me a few extra minutes to kind of express everything that I had on my list and kind of what I heard tonight. And thinking that, I just want to be clear that when we sit down for the budget process, I think we really need to take a hard look at all of this and say, what is in the best interest of the entire city?
Thank you, Councilor Levy. We're going to go to Councilor Anderson, but I believe City Manager Luther may have something just to add for a second.
I just wanted to reiterate that one of the reasons I believe Eric started the conversation tonight looking at several of the buckets of funding for state and federal funds for a variety of services is knowing that our needs are greater than the funding. But also there are funding streams outside of ARPA that can help address some of these issues as well. And so it gets a little complicated because we have multiple funding streams, a variety of different ways to get those dollars into the community, and then and there are different rules attached with them. But I think it's important to look at that big picture, which is what you're able to do holistically during the budget process, and see how can those different buckets all be used in a collaborative way to do the most good for the city. So just kind of bringing us back full circle to that. And just as a reminder, in addition to that 15.2 in the bucket in blue currently on the slide, those other funding streams are available as well. And those will be conversations that will not all be resolved, in the next 6 months. But this is going to be a longer term approach to long-term issues. Thank you.
If I just may follow up with that before we go, just real quick.
Go ahead, Councilor Lee.
And I think, and I like all that, but I think my biggest piece is I just want to make sure that we meet the deadline to have the funds allocated, because like we said, we don't have to have it spent, but at least we got to have it allocated by a certain time. So I want to just make sure that we have it designated, that we have this money allocated, because I guess my biggest fear, not that we will, but I just have to put it, not that we will, but I don't want us to get to the place where we lose any of this money. So I just want to make sure.
That's a good point. Thank you, Councilor Levy. Councilor Anderson.
Yeah, thank you. Councilor Levy took a lot of the stuff I was going to say, so saved us a little bit of time here. But first, Eric, I just really appreciate the matrix too with the road projects. I think that kind of puts into picture what is really important on that part of this pie that we're looking at here. I had a couple questions about the lead water service replacement, and it said required to be replaced by US EPA. Is there a hard deadline that we have to have that all replaced by?
There's not yet, because our water still meets the quality standards under the testing. So had we fallen outside of the range of the testing, they would put us into a program that we would have to replace so many each year until they were gone. But because, similar to what City Manager Luther was talking about earlier, with the quality of the water that we have, we are still meeting those requirements under the testing law. So we aren't placed under any time constraint to replace those at this point.
Is that the same with the sub 6-inch water main replacement too?
It's not, that's not under a testing that we have to do. It's just a matter of we do have to replace those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it said required to be replaced by the state. I just want to see, is there there's no hard deadline with that either? Is that just...
No, not necessarily, but we are, so with the bullet point that we talked about, the couple of audits that we had over the last couple of years, being that that's being brought up on a consistent basis, it's kind of the nudge to, you better get going on some of this stuff. So it's not a hard and fast deadline, but we do have to get going on that.
Yeah, and then just a couple more questions, and then I'll stop talking, is just the process for the allocation of things like the homelessness and parks improvements. What is that process like for the public, and how can they get involved to kind of determine what things are most needed in those two pieces?
So some of that is, of course, tonight. You will want to get public input to see what people were passionate about, what we wanted to see allocated to spend the money on. So, and just while we're talking about parks, I think it's important to note that some of the parks projects that would be included in this are really primarily directed toward the youth of Beloit. You know, those are the kinds of things that the Park and Rec Director is looking at. We have the Park Committee that looks at those things. We have a multitude of parks projects that are already in our existing CIP in the out years that could all potentially be qualified under this particular program, particularly in those qualified census tracts. So we are looking then to also include a public input piece on the parks projects so that we can get out there to the public so that they can understand what those projects that we have actually cost versus what we have to spend, and then get some input as to how might you allocate some of those projects. What's most important to you? What would you put in there and spend this money on, and what would you have to cut out? You know, basically making those decisions. You know, you might have $4 or $5 million worth of projects, but you only have $2 million worth to spend. How might you spend those dollars? So we will be looking to seek input on that as well.
Excellent. And then just because maybe some people might be curious, cybersecurity, can we explain why that's important?
Yeah. So, as you see almost every week, it seems like, you know, the hackers are real. And what they do is they can get into your data, they can lock your data up, and then you don't have access to it. So the more that we can secure that and not allow that to happen, the better off we are. And it ends up ultimately saving the city money to try to get your data back. So it also helps with redundancies across the city. So if you have a point of failure in a certain area, you've got a redundant line that might be able to still continue to provide service. It's also from an emergency management standpoint. How might you be able to back up your data in an off-site location and vice versa? Maybe a neighboring community might be asking us to do the same thing. You might be able to do that and do it quicker through fiber optics versus just regular broadband or radio signal. So exploring those types of items, along with public water and sewer infrastructure cybersecurity as well. So there's a multitude of items that fall under this particular line item as well.
Thank you. And then just the last thing is, what is the hopeful timeline for us to get this allocated? Is there like a deadline you're kind of aiming for?
Well, we have to have it all, you know, allocated and ready to go and by the end of 2024. So we're hoping to get something into the 2023 budget year. So, you know, you guys generally would be approving that in November of this year for next year. So we'd like to have something put together in this budget cycle to have some of the money allocated, or at least, you know, whatever we have to do to get it, you know, obligated. Thank you. So hopefully this year.
Thank you, Eric, and just thank you to everybody who spoke. I really appreciate it. I know we all appreciate it. So keep letting us know what your concerns are. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Councilor Anderson. That's it. I'll just give a few closing comments. First, I want to say that we will continue to be transparent and include the public throughout this process. And as we saw earlier in the presentation, the funds are obligated until December 31st of 2024, but they must be spent by December 31st of 2026. So there will definitely be more future conversations, but I think that this is a good start. So thanks to our residents who came out tonight. I just want you to know that we hear you. We hear each and every one of you. Your input is truly appreciated. I also want to say thanks to our city staff for all their hard work, because it's truly important that we work together during this time in order to effectively and adequately use the ARPA funds. So that said, we will continue, we will have this program rebroadcast, and we certainly welcome any more further input or questions from anyone in the public who's watching at home or anyone that's here present tonight. So thank you all for coming out this evening, and this ends our workshop, our ARPA workshop for today. Thank you all for coming.